So thanks so much for tuning in. And my guest today has been on the front lines of the cannabis reform movement for as long as I've been and as long as I can remember. She's a Loyola trained lawyer who worked for the Marijuana Policy Project as state policy director, has been critical, I'm going to tell you, to expanding state access in all the new states that have expanded. I last teamed up with her in a successful effort to help pass the medical cannabis legislation in Pennsylvania, and realized that she's too often really the unsung hero of this entire movement. People need to know who you are. Karen O'Keefe, thank you so much for being a part of today's podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and everything you've done to move cannabis policy forward.
Well, I got to tell you, though, I mean, I really believe that you have been, you're my inspiration. I mean, literally, you have been here since day one, since I got involved. And what people don't understand, and I think, I got involved, honestly, in the movement really 2001-ish, middle of 2001. But girlfriend, you were there banging away in New Jersey, banging away in New York, banging away in Connecticut, banging away in Maine, banging away across America. So thank you for all the hard work you have done on behalf of everybody who's been a part of this movement.
I'm very fortunate to have a job I love and to work with wonderful people like you to make a more just country.
Let's back up a little bit, though. I'm going to take you back, and I'm sorry to do it. I'll take you back 20 years, and you're, only 21 years old. So hard when you were 1 year old. But, I mean, let's go back to early 2000. I mean, what brought you to the movement?
So in 2000, I was actually in law school, Loyola, New Orleans, and I did a lot of criminal defense.
You were not. Come on. You don't look like you're old enough to have been in law school in 2000. Okay. Just playing.
Well, I was a little younger than other people, but I have a baby face, I guess. I did some criminal defense my last year of law school, and I saw what the stats have backed up throughout the country, that marijuana arrests disproportionately fall on people of color, and in Louisiana, they were exceptionally harsh. So one of the cases that I worked on was an appeal. The gentleman had been sentenced to 20 years for third offense drug offenses just for possession of marijuana, and it, of course, was horribly unjust and still kind of gnaws at me.
Wow. And so that's what brought you to the movement. Then what shifted you over and got you involved with MPP?
Well, after law school, I moved to Washington, D.C., and I just looked for a job that fit what I believed in, and MPP was hiring. And so since then, I was hooked. It's every year, just about, we've had more and more victories to chip away and move the ball forward.
That's the days when your infamous leader, Peter Lewis, was still alive. So I know you work with him quite a bit. And let's talk about those early years, because it's when I got involved, again, I think we were testifying in New Jersey before then Governor Corzine. I remember also testifying in Connecticut in front of their little state or legislative body. And, it was different back then than it is today.
It was. Back then, about 35% of the population supported making marijuana legal. Now it's 66%. When I started, there were a grand total of 8 states with medical cannabis laws on the books. I think all but one of them had been passed by voter initiative. And now we've seen some of the reddest states in the country pass medical cannabis, some by legislation, some by voter initiative. So we've had a massive shift in both public opinion and lawmakers' willingness to enact these laws. But it still has a long way to go.
No, you threw out, you said 66% of the people in the country seem to support medical marijuana laws, but I've seen numbers high as 81%. I've seen numbers in some polls coming back in the mid 80s. Let's talk about right now, and I've heard, conflicting numbers in the last couple of weeks doing my podcast. What is the exact number of states that have now passed some form of either medical or recreational, adult use cannabis law?
So on the polls, for 66% support legalization completely. I've seen 93% in one poll for medical, which is more people than believe that humans landed on the moon, which is truly astounding. There's almost nothing that has that much support. So for states that have some kind of law on the books acknowledging marijuana's medical value, I'd say 49 have at least something symbolic. Idaho is the lone one, absolutely nothing. We have comprehensive medical marijuana laws. But then there's another 4 or so that have more limited laws that are limited only to low THC preparations, but that still allow some kind of access. So you can go to a dispensary with a doctor's recommendation and get something, just not as many. And then there are 11 states that have legalized marijuana for adults generally, not just for medical use.
But I mean, Karen, have you seen anything like this in previous initiatives in the country where you have this number of states that support cannabis, yet the Fed still puts the brakes on?
No, it's really astounding to have 2/3 of the country now, more than 2/3 of the country, have openly operating stores with the blessing of the state that are actually committing federal felonies every single day. And more bizarrely, Congress has those laws on the books still that criminalize marijuana. But every year since 2014, they passed a rider that says the Department of Justice cannot use any of the funds appropriated to target state compliant medical marijuana businesses. So essentially they're saying, here's the law, but ignore it.
Do you fear that if, in fact, we don't see a blue wave coming in November and we get a red wave, do you think that that'll be another one of these laws that, this administration goes after?
Well, the administration's been in power for 4 years, and there were some worrying signs for a little bit there. Jeff Sessions indicated and did repeal the Cole memo that was kind of protect businesses. It didn't happen. And given the enormous political support for not only making marijuana legal, but not targeting these businesses, and given the number of even red states that have these laws on the books, I'm optimistic that we can keep the pressure up and that we won't see a backsliding. And 2 of the states, there are 4 states that have legalization initiatives on the ballot, and 2 of them are deep red. One of them is South Dakota, and another is Montana. So for the more red states and the more states in general pass these laws, the more pressure there is not to have them thwarted by the federal government.
So now we have New Jersey, Arizona, South Dakota, and Montana all have ballot initiatives to convert over to adult use, or what you would consider recreational. And then South Dakota and Mississippi. And when I saw Mississippi, I was thinking to myself, are you kidding me? Doesn't Mississippi already have a medical marijuana law? But I guess they don't, even though the University of Mississippi has been dispensing cannabis, marijuana, to patients for now over 50 years.
That's right. So the federal marijuana is all grown in Mississippi, but people who live in Mississippi have no access to legal medical marijuana.
Which is another one of these insanities. Let's do some general talking, about just the whole idea. I mean, let's start right there. A lot of people in this country are not aware of the fact that under G.H.W. Bush, Daddy Bush, he passed I guess it was a humanitarian, did he do that by executive order?
I wish I remembered. I know there was a patient named Randall, and I'm forgetting his last name, who sued after being arrested for growing marijuana in DC. And then they opened this compassionate use program to him, and a relatively small number of other patients had signed up.
Yeah, I think it was 20 at the first. They opened it to 20 patients, and then they got inundated with thousands of requests from patients who back then, because the AIDS pandemic was starting, and so lots of people flooded in, and they shut the program down, but they kept it in place. And so for a lot of people who are tuning in right now for the first time to our podcast, a lot of people didn't know that the federal government made a law that allowed for the University of Mississippi to grow, package, and send out across the country to 20 patients once a month, every single month, for now over 50 years, cannabis, that these people ended up getting a small card that they could, that basically said, it was a get out of jail card that said, I can carry my cannabis anywhere I want in the entire country and leave me alone because the president said it's okay. And we have done this indiscriminately. Every single senatorial bill, every bill that's passed has been a budget for the United States government, has included a budget line that has paid for this University of Mississippi program for over 50 years. Yet we are still arguing today, and we have somebody who is ignorant, like a Jeff Sessions, stand up and say, well, there is no medical marijuana usage, there's no truth to it. I felt like saying, but can somebody just smack him upside the back of his head? But a lot of people don't know this.
Mm-hmm. And there's 2 surviving patients that are still every month getting a tin of cannabis from the federal government, while the government at the same time fails to acknowledge cannabis's medical value.
Being herb, and I even had one of herb's canisters, and I've kept it and held on to it, now for almost 20 years myself. It's really kind of just ridiculous that we are still arguing the medical viability and medical efficaciousness of a product that our government itself believes is medically efficacious.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the federal government will say again and again, there's not enough research, and then they'll make it exceptionally difficult to conduct the kind of studies they say are needed. And at the same time, there are dozens and dozens, hundreds actually, of studies on medical cannabis, some of which are the placebo-controlled double-blind standard studies that are the gold standard of studies. And the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine reported on all these studies and found that there is conclusive or substantial evidence that cannabis helps for some things, including chronic pain. So at the same time that the most prestigious medical body in the country says it works, the federal government still closes its eyes to it.
And even let's layer on a little bit more, but the fact of the matter is that back in 1998 and a half, our federal government went ahead and wrote an application for a patent on components from cannabis, CBD particularly, and granted itself a patent in 2002. And in its own abstract, it reports clearly what it believes the medical efficaciousness is of the plant, and has controlled that patent ever since. And yet we still say that it's not medically viable. How ignorant is this?
Appalling.
Does these conversations come up in some of the discussions that you have when you go around to different states, especially now the last few? And again, I'm sorry, I missed a little, you broke up a little bit, but so this year we will go from 35 to possibly 41 states that agree with some form of formal medical or adult usage law.
So we count 33 states as having comprehensive medical cannabis laws, and we could have 2 more, Mississippi and South Dakota. So that would put us at 35 by our count. But there's a lot of states kind of in the middle that could arguably be counted.
Okay. All right. So still, but 35, that is well over, that's right, 74%. So we literally right now are sitting at a position where this large a number of people, and again, you said 90+% of people believe in medical cannabis, and especially coming out of this COVID pandemic, I bet you that number even goes up even higher, because we've seen that cannabis has been the only pandemic, recession-proof business in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And considered an essential service in almost every one of the states that have passed the law.
Thank goodness, because if it wasn't, then people couldn't get their medical cannabis.
Correct, and which would be insane, especially right now. I can just imagine how, people would be reacting to having to revert back to drinking instead of using cannabis. And I don't know where we'd be as a nation.
Mm-hmm. Or using opiates or far more dangerous drugs than cannabis.
Absolutely. So, let's talk a little bit about the states that you're working on directly right now. You clearly are involved in what's going on in New Jersey, Arizona, South Dakota, and Montana. What's it look like? And do you think that these ballot initiatives will go through?
So the polling looks good, but we can never take anything for granted. The more people volunteer and donate, the better chance all of these measures have. South Dakota, it will be the first time ever a state votes on both medical marijuana and legalization. And it's actually a state, I think the only state, where voters previously voted down medical cannabis. So that's the one we're mobilizing the most to have volunteers, and people can go to the website, sd2020.org/volunteer if they want to sign up from home. They could do text messages, make phone calls, otherwise help out. We wouldn't have run the initiatives if polling didn't look like they were all winnable, but certainly you don't want to ever take anything for granted, and it's really important that people mobilize and help all of these initiatives happen. In the legalization states, these are all states that don't even have decriminalization yet. So people, just for simple possession, are getting criminal records and going to jail in all 4 of the states where it's on the ballot, which makes it all the more important that this pass.
Wow. And now tell me about Mississippi's got something weird going on there too, correct?
Yeah, so they have 2 different medical marijuana initiatives. One of them is fairly broad, has a good list of qualifying conditions, a pretty open market, so people have plenty of access to medical cannabis. And then the legislature passed a competing initiative that they put on the ballot that essentially lets the legislature write the rules. The same legislature that failed to enact medical marijuana year after year after year. And it's written in a very restrictive way. So there's no reason to think that if 65A, which is the legislative one, passed, that there would actually be a good workable program. It could have very few qualifying conditions. It could just be certain strains, certain preparations with almost no access in the state. So voters will be asked, first, do you want either or neither initiative to pass? And then they'll be asked, if one passes, which one do you want? So to support a good medical cannabis proposal, they should say either and then 65, which is the broader initiative that will have a pretty broad range of qualifying conditions and access.
Do you think this was just done in some tricky dicky way to, confuse the electorate so that they don't know what to pick? And then if they pick the legislative one, then they can say, well, you passed it, so leave us alone. We'll do it when we get to it.
Yep, that's the concern. The legislature has not been at all supportive of medical cannabis, so there's no reason to think this was a good faith effort to put forth a workable proposal.
Wow. So, and how many people in Mississippi are aware of this?
I don't know, but I know the campaign's working hard to educate as many people as possible to reduce the chance of confusion and it not passing.
Okay. And, now that, again, crystal ball me for a second. So if, let's say, at the end of this session or at November 4th, we wake up and all of these pass, do you think this will swing the pendulum a little bit in the way to make the Fed say we got to do something? And then I gotta guess. I mean, it depends on who ends up winning the big seat, because if it's the current guy, he's going to wait for his Uday and Kusei to figure out how they can make money before he allows anybody to make money, right?
We'll see. Donald Trump said that he supports the States Act, which would at least have a hands-off position on state marijuana laws. He said that a while ago, but he doesn't seem to have done a whole lot to try to make it happen. There are certainly some Republicans in the Senate that have been supportive. Cory Gardner in Colorado and the 2 senators from Alaska have been both supportive. So, the more states move forward, the better the chances are for federal progress, regardless. And the more popular support increases, the sooner it'll happen. So we'll be pushing whoever wins the Senate and whoever wins the presidency for as much reform as possible. We certainly prefer the MORE Act, which is the most comprehensive and would deschedule cannabis nationwide and would include robust social equity provisions as well.
Absolutely. Well, then we'll come back and talk about the social equity positions, because I've been a little less heartened by some of the initiatives across the country right now. Anyway, because a lot of them have been just token initiatives rather than real initiatives. But let's talk about that in a minute. But this war on cannabis has been just ridiculously devastating to our communities as a whole. And you've got some ideas about how we can start to repair some of this damage. What would that look like?
So the 3 main things that we push to be in legislation are, first, having a substantial amount of the tax revenue go to those same communities that have been so disproportionately targeted by the war on marijuana. Second, making sure that the industry itself is inclusive and diverse and has real opportunities for the communities most hard hit by the war on drugs. So that's ownership of businesses, management, and staffing. And finally, making sure that we wipe out the past records and ideally release people from prison that have been incarcerated for something and that have been marked with a scarlet letter of a conviction for something that's now legal.
That's right. Also, I've been working a little bit with a program that Stevie D has been involved with in California, and trying my best. I think it's the Last Prison Project, and trying my best to help as much as I possibly can. But it seems, I've said this over and over again. I think one of the biggest issues that still faces the cannabis industry is education. We have tried our best, and there's a lot of people who jumped into this business in the last 3 or 4 years because it's, the gold rush, green rush in their mind, and failed to educate, number one, the consumer, and number two, failed to educate the masses in general. I think, we're living at a time where a lot of people don't understand it's that it's been the baby boomers that have legislatively moved this forward. You look at the age group of most of the legislators across the country. When we started seeing baby boomers kind of hit the spot where they're now, local senators and people in politics, they kind of remember. I remember when I was in high school, my kids, my brother and sister were doing it, and they didn't turn into heroin addicts. So maybe it's okay. So I don't understand why this industry doesn't spend more time funding organizations like yours, but funding those organizations that are educating people across the country as to the value. What are we going to do, and how do we change that?
Yeah. Well, anything you can do to help get out the word is most appreciated. Anyone who wants to donate, to plug into our email alerts, they can contact our elected officials. Our website's marijuanapolicy.org or mpp.org. We certainly do some public education, but we're a pretty scrappy, small nonprofit, and I think the same's true for a lot of the movement in general. So most of our advocacy and education focuses on those states where we're working on a bill or working on a ballot initiative. Luckily, we already have massive public support. It's just translating that public support into laws. And there's been a longstanding perception among some elected officials that cannabis policy reform is far more controversial than it is. And that's just not the case. We talked about the numbers early on. There are so many issues that move forward that have far, far less support than making marijuana legal, and especially than medical cannabis.
Well, especially when you look at it again from a recession-proof business tax opportunity, I can't see why a lot of states, can't just look at what's happened in the last 6 months and recognize how much value this would be to their state coffers.
Yep. So Vermont is on the verge. It's one signature away from legalizing sales of marijuana. It would be the second state ever to pass a comprehensive legalization law through the legislature and the governor. And then there's as many as 10 other states that are seriously looking at it legislatively next year. So our hope is, when you put together all of the other reasons to make marijuana legal, the strong popular support, and you look at the issues that these lawmakers are facing, where they have huge budget deficits and huge numbers of people newly out of work that need jobs, especially when you compare making marijuana legal to other options, it's a no-brainer. It creates tens of thousands of new jobs, hundreds of millions of dollars of new revenue, and it can be built in a way that is equitable and inclusive and lifts up communities that have been the hardest hit by the war on drugs.
Well, what kind of impact do you think this farm bill has had on the movement in general? Because I think a lot of people think that just because you passed some laws that allow for hemp, and there's the argument about who tests it to make sure that it's the exact number, and if one plant in an entire truck turns out to be a little just 0.001 too high, you burn the whole truck, which is really stupid. But that seems to have been, something that, again, I think that the Senate did to placate and then also used to actually enforce the draconian laws more than actually open them up.
Yeah, so, it was the first major federal step forward on the plant, cannabis/hemp. So it's certainly progress, and it could be built from. It changed the mindset of some people from this. Mitch McConnell obviously embraced the Farm Act and was a champion of it. So far, he hasn't had a similar revelation when it comes to marijuana in general. But I think it's moved things forward a little bit. But we certainly need a lot bigger progress still.
He's got to make a little bit more money. That's what he's got to do. And he's already made quite a bit. I think if you take a look at, his net worth before the passage of the Farm Bill and his net worth after, somehow some of that seems to have slipped into his bank account. I'm just saying. I'm just putting that out there. But so how do we get more and more, and again, it's a redundant question, but I want to try to figure out how do we kind of push the pendulum a little further. I mean, since conservatives are the ones that are kind of holding back, how do we educate them enough? The information is there. What do we got to do? Go down and start, waving signs in front of their office, marching again?
Everyone should write letters to the editor, call your elected official, post to their Twitter page, do so in a respectful, polite way. There are so many people among the public at large and elected officials that have moved on this issue. We've had a doubling of popular support for legalization, and a lot of lawmakers are in the same position where they have questions, they have concerns, but we've seen many, many, many change their position from dead set opposed to understanding that regulation is a better course of action. People who have a personal story, meeting in person, sharing that with the elected official, really constituent outreach in state legislative districts is huge. So many state legislators have very small districts, and especially in some of the smaller states, and just a handful of people reaching out can help. It's election season, so a lot of the lawmakers in many states are trying to get reelected. Raising it with candidates for state senate, for state legislature is helpful. And those candidates who are supportive, considering donating to them if the person otherwise supports them, or volunteering. A lot of these lawmakers only have a handful of volunteers. So to kind of solidify this issue and also to help elect people that are allies, it's worth engaging. Paying attention to when legislative hearings are coming up and submitting written testimony, and otherwise just raising the profile and your voices and showing up for lobby days, showing up for rallies, doing so in a respectful, non-hostile way is something I would encourage everyone to do.
Look, I got to take a little break to pay some bills. And when we come back, let's talk a little bit more about just, in general, some of the success stories that we've now started to hear across the country. And because a lot of people don't hear a lot of success. We hear, it's going to go the way of California. They seem to use California as a bad example of how cannabis laws can be put in place. And when you take a look at California, I think California has made a couple missteps. They've taxed the product so highly that, you've opened the door to a black market again. So let's talk a little bit more about success stories when we come back. We'll take a little break. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back. And my guest today has been on the front lines of cannabis reform movement for as long as I've been. She's a trained lawyer, and her work in marijuana policy project at the state as the state director of policy has been critical in expanding safe access to cannabis in lots of states, and especially all the new states across the country. Again, thank you so much, Karen O'Keefe, for being a part of the show today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, talk a little bit about some of the success stories that we've had so that people understand that marijuana has not been this thing that most people think it was going to be. Oh my God, it's going to ruin my children's lives. We know for a fact now in a lot of the states and the majority of the states that have passed a medical marijuana bill that opioid addiction has gone down because recent studies have proven that cannabis is an exit drug for opioid addiction rather than an entree to. Talk a little bit about some of the other successes that we've had in the industry.
Sure. So in both medical cannabis and legalization, opponents long made it sound like this would cause teenagers to use more marijuana, graduation rates would go down, workplace injuries would go up. Now it's been 8 years since the first 2 states legalized marijuana, and none of that has happened. There's before and after data on teen marijuana use. As a whole, there's no increase. A bunch of them are down a little bit within the margin of error, and a few are up within the margin of error, meaning as a whole, it's stable. Graduation rates are up, and the number of people who have workplace injuries in Colorado and Washington is down, meaning they're paying less for workers' comp because fewer people are getting injured, and those that are getting injured are having less serious injuries. So we haven't seen any of the kind of horrible things that opponents predicted. What we have seen is in Washington state, the state has brought in over $2 billion in cannabis tax revenue since sales began in 2014. And when you think about what that money means, it can mean they put a lot of it into Medicaid for more people to have insurance. The kind of impact it has on people's lives to be able to have medical care is just huge. It's not just, a number of money. And we've also seen 40,000 people signed up to work directly in the marijuana industry in Colorado alone. So these are people that might otherwise be unemployed in the midst of a pandemic, that have jobs, that are able to bring in revenue and to put it into their local economies. We've also seen the number of people that are searched when they're stopped at a traffic stop decrease dramatically. So we think of the awareness we have of just how risky it is to have unnecessary police-civilian interaction, the possibility of violence, even death, especially for Black Americans, and just reducing those number of searches by having police not be able to say, I smell marijuana, and then search a person is huge. We've seen arrest numbers go down in the states where marijuana is legal. We would like it to go down even more, but the fact that we have 40 states with prohibition means that there's still illegal production and illegal sales, and we still see some arrests in that area.
We have seen in California, which is staggeringly, offensive to me. We've seen the numbers of arrests go up. Now, what's that all about?
California has been a mess forever. So California's medical marijuana law it didn't involve any state licensing or any state regulation for the most part. Growers weren't regulated at all, and some of the businesses were licensed by cities for the dispensaries, others weren't. So in LA, which I'm right next to, there were literally hundreds of openly operating storefronts that were completely illegal. So the consumer has no idea what's legal and what's not. Legalization happened back in 2016, and they have been very, very slow to roll out legal businesses. So at the same time, you still have these openly operating storefronts that are illegal but haven't had the opportunity to transition and become legal regulated stores because it's been very, very slow. So it's really sad that there's still been such a slow transition and that we're still seeing so many arrests and that it's actually increased. We need more rapid transitions to legal regulated stores so consumers are safe. When you have these illegal stores, it's a danger to people working there and it's a danger to consumers. We actually saw a butane hash factory that was illegal. There were places selling butane extracts that blew up and injured 11 firefighters recently. And we've seen huge numbers of these illegal products that are being sold at illegal dispensaries and produced illegally, testing positive for additives that can be very dangerous and pesticides that can convert to hydrogen cyanide. So it's, in my mind, legitimate to try to get rid of the illegal products, but you need to have people have a quick, easy transition to the legal market, and that has not happened. And part of it's just because of the enormous legacy market. Part of it is because California has long supplied other states. So as long as the 40 other states have marijuana illegal, someone's going to be growing that marijuana. And a lot of it's grown in national parks. There's huge issues with hazardous waste. I've seen issues with workers being exploited sexually, having their wages stolen. So it's not that all illegal operators are bad necessarily, but as long as something's unregulated, there are so many possible risks for workers, the environment, and communities. And prohibition really is the cause of that. And the more states have prohibition, the more you're going to continue to see this kind of activity go unabated.
It drives me crazy that we as an industry, though, don't do enough to police ourselves. I know, MPP has been here for 20 years, and, an organization that I turn to for information and turn to see if I can be of any help. Why can't, there was a period before the pandemic where we were seeing, multiple conventions all over the country. And, I was speaking at several of them and, would roll in and it would seem like it was, some brand new statement when I would say, when are we going to stop fighting amongst each other and start trying to work together? And, I get these rousing applause as if I've said something new. That's not new. I mean, I don't understand what's it going to take for this industry to A, police itself, and B, come together.
Yeah. I certainly would like to see more of it. There's always going to be some tensions within the industry. There's the desire to have, from a lot of people to have small businesses and others that want to have larger businesses. But I'm not sure any industry can completely police itself. You just have the economic incentive. If there's some, in my opinion, you need some kind of rules and somebody enforcing rules to make sure that pesticides aren't used that are illegal and that you don't have additives that are dangerous and that you have that kind of thing. So I think there's certainly a role for regulators, but it would be great to see more cohesion within the industry to push for these things. And we have seen some developments. We've seen NCIA and others come up with policy positions, suggestions for testing, but it's a small nascent industry and it certainly hasn't matured as much as hopefully it will soon.
If you had a crystal ball that you could put on, if in two ways. One, crystal ball, when you think the Fed will, you just said we have 6 states this go around, and then next year we'll have 10 states that are going to put forth a separate type of initiative. How can you crystal ball and think what might happen? And again, yes, it depends on who's sitting in the main seat, but
yeah.
What do you think?
I think it could happen within 2 to 5 years, depending on how quickly things move, depending who's in power, depending how quickly we mobilize. And I suspect we won't see, at the point marijuana is federally legal, it's still illegal in 40 states, of course. So you still would have the state by state battle because 99% of all arrests are at the state and local level. Changing federal prohibition would be huge and would prevent immigration issues, it would prevent banking issues, it would prevent the lingering criminality, but it's not a complete fix. But I think it could happen as soon as 2 to 5 years, but it could be a lot slower. We've had huge support for medical cannabis for a very long time, and even that isn't federally legal yet.
And that's really interesting. And again, I was one of these people who thought all along that, we were going to get this shift where we would go to adult use and then kind of shift back to medical use, especially as our population ages. Because I think, again, baby boomers, there's a lot of them out there that remember being in high school and sneaking under the bleachers and smoking a joint. And they have had successful careers their entire lives, never went on to be heroin addicts. And so they've changed their attitude a little bit. Especially some of them are looking at their medicine cabinet and seeing, 15 and 16 prescriptions and recognize that, they can reduce some of that using cannabinoids. And there's been so much research that's been done that's talking about now the efficaciousness as a cannabinoid for, as an anti-inflammatory. So I guess, do you think that we're just going to have to let this whole generation die out before we see a change?
No, we've seen, if we've got Mississippi voting on medical marijuana and South Dakota and Montana voting on legalization, we've seen the polls show an increase both in overall and within each generation. So we still have less support, the older generations you look to, but each of them are increasing within each generation too. And I think it's something, a lot of people had assumptions of what would happen once marijuana is legal, but it's been 8 years now. So you've had time to see the sky didn't fall. And interestingly, you mentioned medical cannabis. The majority of people who are using medical marijuana through these adult use laws are actually using it for medical purposes.
No, go ahead, keep going. I'm just nodding yes to you because, I have been a person who just believes, and I've talked about it quite a bit on the show, that I think anybody who's drawn to cannabis is drawn to cannabis for a medical reason anyway. They may not even recognize themselves, even if it's a matter of wanting to relax, wanting to, come home and or go to sleep better or just in general feel better, just general health and wellness. I think people who gravitate towards cannabis are doing so for an underlying medical reason, even if they don't admit it. But go ahead.
So in Denver, there was a survey of 1,000 people buying from the adult use, not the medical counter. They didn't have a card or a recommendation. And of them, more than 60% said they were using it for pain, and more than 70% said they were using it for insomnia. I might have those numbers reversed, but they're both over 60%. And most of those people said they were using it in lieu of or were reducing their other medications for pain or for sleep. So we see a little bit of a drop-off in people registered in medical marijuana programs. Sometimes, like in Oregon, we see a huge drop-off where it's a very expensive fee. Some people don't want to be on the list. They don't want to have to go to the doctor for approval. But yeah, that's one reason I don't use the word recreational, because most of the people using adult use cannabis are actually not using it for recreational purposes or for fun. They're using it as a medicine.
Absolutely. Well, if again, you're open stage. So what would you like to say to the industry right now to get us on track to finally getting and passing some sort of federal legislation?
I'd say support our work. We are moving state bills. We've been responsible for the lead organization for 8 of the 11 legalization laws that passed and most of the medical laws. We're very good at what we do, not to brag too much, but we find good lobbyists, we find good organizers, we find good teams. We know that policy stuff inside and out. And the more state laws pass, the more opportunity there is, the more justice there is, and the more pressure there is on the federal government as well. I think a lot of people kind of have either a free rider opinion or an opinion this will just legalize itself. And it is a battle to pass any of these laws. Vermont's law took 4 or 5 years just to get the legalization law done. And these laws could pass in 1 year, they could pass in 5 years. How big of a budget we have, how big of a team we have is crucial to actually being able to pass these quickly. And I think we should know from medical cannabis that this isn't just going to magically pass on its own quickly because people support it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Karen. I can't believe thank you enough for being here. She is the state policy director for the Marijuana Policy Project. And, I can't say enough to say thank you for being a part of the movement. And thank you for being a part of our podcast here today. And we want to have you back anytime you have anything to say. You have a home here.
Really appreciate it. Thank you for all you've done.
Absolutely. Thank you.